Salle as they present the theme for Back to the Future. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we take time to honor our senior parents who are involved in the football, band, cheerleading programs here at LaSalle High School. The parents' spirit of sacrifice and support for their sons and daughters, as well as LaSalle High School, has been an inspiration. We now introduce them, give them a small token of appreciation, and say thank you. We begin with the members of the football team and their parents. Tim Osdenmore and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Robin Osdenmore. Greg Birding and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gerald Birding. Chris Booker and his parents, Janelle and Jack Booker. Bill Burke and his parents, Jerry and Cheryl Burke. Andy Kavanaugh and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Kavanaugh. Paul Denisi and his mother, Mrs. Margie Denisi. Bill Dowers and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bill Dowers. Martin Isley and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Isley. Paul Freese and his father, Mr. Donald Freese. Pat Godey and his parents, Dick and Marilyn Godey. Kevin Gold and his parents, Ken and Sharon Gold. Ken Greavy and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ken Greavy. Andy Helsinger and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Helsinger. Chris Huell and his parents, Dave and Terry Huell. Keith Inderhees and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Scott Inderhees. Mike Jones and his parents, Jim and Linda Bartell. Jim Carwish and his parents, Bernie and Colleen Carwish. Jason Keeman and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Keeman. Mick Kennedy and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Kennedy. Jeffrey Knight and his mother, Jerry Knight. Kurt Brett and his parents, Nick and Elaine Brett. Tom Larkin and his mother, Mrs. Trudy Larkin. Rob Lewis and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Lewis. Brian McCauley and his parents, Carol and Bill McCauley. Pat O'Connor and his parents, Pat and Marcia O'Connor. Mike Overby and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mike Overby. Kevin Reardon and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Martin Reardon. P.J. Reiner and his parents, Jim and Mary Kay Reiner. Paul Rossolo and his father, Mr. Edward Rossolo. Ken Saunders and his parents, Chris and Rusty Saunders. Tom Sherman and his mother, Mrs. Robert Sherman. Brett Sneever and his parents, Roger and Carla Sneever. Chris Schaus and his mother, Anita Collins, and his father, John Schaus. Chris Sullivan and his parents, Steve and Diane Sullivan. Ron Webb and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ron Webb. Aaron Wilkerson and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bill Wilkerson. And now to the senior members of the band and their parents. Deanna Ackerman and her parents, Hannah and David Ackerman. Jeffrey Brunsman and his parents, Stan and Joanne Brunsman. Nancy Berg and her parents, Jerry and Larry Berg. Tanya Cripe and her parents, Mr. and Mrs. John Cripe. Tim Dixon and his parents, Shirley and George Dixon. Dennis Donahue and his mother, Mrs. Anna Kresser, and his father, Tim Donahue, and special appreciation to his grandmother, Ruth Donahue. Beth Eichholz and her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joe Eichholz. Patty Finley and her parents, Nancy and Tom Finley. Craig Fritz and his parents, Carol and Al Fritz. Vicki Honrod and her parents, Nancy and Russell Honrod. Jeff Irvin and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dwight Irvin. Joe Coney and his parents, Rose and Jim Coney. Jim Kramer and his parents, Pat and Dan Kramer. Ben Lighthall and his mother, Mrs. Vicki Lighthall. Matt McGowan and his mother, Mrs. Mary Bessel. Angie Niebling and her parents, Phyllis and Jerry Niebling. Bob Siegert and his parents, Don and Robert Siegert. Marty Strohoffer and his parents, Joyce and Ray Strohoffer. Katie Thompson and her parents, Kathy and Sid Thompson. Joe Turk and his parents, William and Karen Turk. Matt Weisgerber and his parents, Linda and Frank Weisgerber. Sandy Wilson and her parents, Angela and John Dagenbach. And now the senior cheerleaders and their parents, Robin Ott and her mother, Sharon Ott. Christy Smiley and her parents, Jim and Babe Smiley. And Christy Waddell and her father, William Waddell. Let's give them all a big Lancer thank you.